Today I'm going to show you how to shoot a hyperlapse sequence. A hyperlapse is basically a time lapse, but the difference is that the camera is moving and it moves over quite a long distance. So this is a time lapse and this is a hyperlapse. Now Instagram do have an app called hyperlapse. This can create some really great sequences for Instagram, but if you want better quality for YouTube videos, you need to make your hyperlapses with a decent camera. Any DSLR, point and shoot or mirrorless camera will work really well. You just want that little bit better quality to produce a much better hyperlapse. There are several different ways to shoot them. The easiest way is to fit your camera to the inside of your car. If the road isn't too bumpy and it's quite a smooth tarmac road, you'll get a really nice sequence. Alternatively, you can be in the front of a train or maybe even a bus. Because the vehicle is moving, you make sure that the camera is locked into place and you just keep firing a time lapse as normal. If you're not sure how to shoot time lapses, click on the eye in the corner or the link in the description. This will take you to another of my videos. The other way to shoot a hyperlapse is to do it manually. You can either shoot from a monopod, a tripod or handheld. In the example today, I'm going to shoot handheld. The best way to start is to shoot in the middle of the day when there's enough light about to shoot handheld without getting any motion blur. Now with a time lapse, you'll keep the camera perfectly still. If you move it at all, you tend to ruin the time lapse. With a hyperlapse, you'll move with intention. You'll either measure out certain distances or take certain steps of the same distance. There is a trick to this, and you need a little bit of rhythm, but it's quite easy and straightforward to do. To start with, I suggest taking even-sized steps sideways. This will ensure the gaps are the same between frames. You will feel a bit silly doing this, but if you stitch the images together well and you've shot a good sequence, you can get a really good hyperlapse from it. So this is how I do it. Work out your settings in manual mode. The reason you do this is to keep the settings exactly the same throughout the sequence. I basically make sure my shutter speed is fast enough to shoot handheld, the ISO is as low as possible, and the aperture is about f8 to f11. I shoot no wider than 24mm. Any wider than this, and the sequence starts to become hard to stitch because of distortion on the edges of the frame. Work out the path that you'll be traveling along. Here I walked a few hundred yards along the bridge. I'll make sure I've got a target point, which I'll either keep on a crosshair or where some of the grid lines cross. Then I'll keep that point on the crosshair every time I take a photograph. For instance, in this shot, I've lined up the top of the building with this top crosshair. To select grid lines, go to menu 2, page 6 out of 9. I then select square grid so I have lots of crosses all over the image, so I can choose one of these and lock onto my target. Next, focus on your chosen subject and then set the focus to manual mode. For this sequence, I was shooting with a manual focus lens. I focused in to make sure I had critical focus on my cityscape. The reason why you set it to manual focus is because you don't want the focus to hunt around while you're shooting the sequence. You set your settings and your focus to manual so everything stays exactly the same. Just make sure you don't touch the focus ring during the sequence. For the next bit, you need to get some kind of rhythm going. Frame up your shot, take a step, frame up your shot, take a step, and then repeat. You'll keep doing this for around about 300 shots, and then this will give you 12 seconds of footage at 25 frames a second. The two main things that you need to do is keep your horizon straight and also keep that target on the crosshairs that you selected. As long as you do these two things, it'll be quite straightforward to build the sequence afterwards. Once you've completed your sequence, the next thing to do is process it. Your arms will get tired when doing this, and it'll feel a little bit like endurance photography. But if you stick with it, you can get some really good looking sequences. Once you get comfortable doing them this way, you can try them with a monopod or off a tripod. I've done one or two at night off a tripod. It did take about 2 or 3 hours to complete the whole sequence, but I'm really happy with the sequence that I got. I use Lightroom and After Effects to process my hyperlapses. If you don't have these and you want to try this out, click on the link in the description. This will take you to a 30-day free trial. So first of all, bring the shots into Lightroom. Make the corrections for the lens that you are using. Make any adjustments you want to make the image look a little bit better. Sync all of the settings so they are all exactly the same. Then export as full-size JPEGs named in a sequence. It's important that you get them in the right order and name them as a sequence. Then After Effects will have a much easier time of working out the image sequence that it's going to process into a video. Then export them to a separate folder so they are separated from any other images you may have taken. Once Lightroom has processed the images, open up After Effects. Once you've opened up After Effects, import them as an image sequence. Make sure image sequence is ticked. It normally does this automatically when it sees a sequence of images. Then drag the sequence down to this little square to create a film strip. When you initially play it on the timeline, it'll be quite jittery. Now it needs some stabilization. Click on Effects and Presets, search for Warp Stabilizer. When you find it, drag it onto your clip. It will take a while to process, so now it's time to go and get a cup of tea or have a bit of a break. Once it's processed, select the timeline and press the spacebar. It will then render and play the clip. Now I've never had great results from just doing one round of Warp Stabilizer. Maybe it's the way I shoot, or maybe my hands are a little bit shaky. But I find this doesn't stabilize it fully. There is a way around this though. Right-click on the clip, click on Pre-Compose, and select Move All Attributes into the new composition, and then click OK. You'll then be presented with another clip. Add Warp Stabilizer to this clip again, and wait for it to process. I've done some hyperlapses that have been okay with just one layer of warp stabilization, and I've had some others that it's taken up to 4 rounds of warp stabilization to get it perfectly steady. Just keep doing it and keep previewing the clip. Once it's steady, you don't need to add any more. The more careful you are when shooting the hyperlapse, the less stabilization you'll need. So this probably needs one more round of stabilization. So again, I'll pre-compose, making I've selected Move All Attributes to the new composition, and click OK. Then I'll add more stabilization. Now you can see it is a lot smoother. To output, click on Composition and Add to Render Queue. I'm on a Mac, so I'll change the output file to a ProRes file. Click on Lossless, Format Options, Video Codec, and Apple ProRes 422HQ. And then click on OK, and then OK again. Find a place to save it, and then click on Render. Once it's rendered, you can bring it into your normal editing software and add it to your video. Now there are a few things I've learned from shooting hyperlapses, and sometimes it can be really frustrating. You'll have spent all that time getting the sequence, and then you bring it back onto your computer, and it's got really big errors that are almost impossible to get rid of. So if you avoid these mistakes, you'll get better looking hyperlapses. You want to avoid shooting into the sun. This will cause the lens to flare, and this lens flare will jitter around. Even when you stabilize the shot, the lens flare will still move around in the shot, and it's almost impossible to remove. You want to keep your horizon as level as possible. Then Warp Stabilizer will find it easier to process the sequence. You don't want to shoot with anything wider than a 24mm. Any wider than this, and it has a lot of distortion either side of the frame. Any small movements will be exaggerated, and then After Effects will find it a lot harder to stabilize the footage. You also want to shoot the hyperlapse when it's quiet. The worst thing is when you're walking along a path and someone else either stops and takes a photo there or gets in your way and doesn't realize what you're doing. So make sure you go at a quiet time and the path is clear. One thing to take into consideration when you're planning your path is to make sure that nothing comes in front of your subject. Even though this might cause a nice parallax, sometimes Warp Stabler really struggles when something comes in front of the subject. It may lock onto that, or the stabilization might move around a bit. So I tend to move around the subject and have the parallaxing effect with the things behind the subject that I'm shooting. One last thing is to try and shoot with a manual focus lens if you have one. In an automatic lens, whenever you take a shot with a smaller aperture, the aperture blades will close down, you'll take the shot and they'll open back up. So they'll close down every time you press the shutter button. As they move backwards and forwards, you'll get minute differences in the aperture, and this will cause a slight flickering. With a manual focus lens, you'll set the aperture on the lens and it'll stay in that one position for the whole time. This tends to give a much smoother sequence. And that's about it. Hyperlapses do take a lot of time and effort, but once you've created a few, they can get quite addictive. You will look a little bit of a weirdo stepping and taking a shot, and people will look at you funny, but it's well worth the effort. As always, if you like what you see, give me a thumbs up. If you didn't, give me a thumbs down. And for weekly tutorials, hints and tips in photography and videography, subscribe and turn on notifications. I'll see you next time.